Today we will do Christ's address to the third church in the book of Revelation, the church at Pergamum. And to the angel of the church in Pergamum write, the one who has the sharp two-edged sword says this, I know where you dwell, where Satan's throne is, and you hold fast my name, and did not deny my faith even in the days of Antipas, my faithful witness, who was killed among you, where Satan dwells. But I have a few things against you, because you have there some who hold the teaching of Balaam, who kept teaching Balak to put a stumbling block before the sons of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols, and to commit acts of immorality. So you also have some who in the same way hold the teachings of the Nicolaitans. Therefore repent, or else I am coming to you quickly, and I will make war against them with the sword of my mouth. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who conquers, to him I will give some of the hidden manna, and I will give him a white stone, and a new name written in the stone, which no one knows but he who receives it. Now, you can see here, if you saw the previous ones, you know that most of these major cities have a theater. Pergamum has a couple of different theaters, and theirs is built right in here on a very tall hill at the very top. You can see that the view that came with this thing was pretty impressive. The city of Pergamum, which is modern-day Bergamo, lies 40 miles to the north of Smyrna, which was our last church, and 15 miles inland. Centuries earlier, it had become a proud capital of the Attilid kingdom, ruling much of what is today western Turkey. So before Rome annexed this territory, this was already the capital of a different kingdom, the Attilid kingdom, and so a lot was put into this city. And now, under Roman rule, this city is still the political capital of that province. So the city of Pergamum was sort of the headquarters for Roman authority in this region. In Roman times, Pergamum boasted a library of 200,000 volumes, a library that is second in size only to that in Alexandria in Egypt. The geographical setting of the city was striking. A walled acropolis, the location of many of its temples and civic buildings, stood on a steep hill 1,300 feet above the rest of the city. From there, an immense altar to Zeus, the Savior, looked down on the city. And so, like I said, if you live down in the main city, you look up on the hill and you see the most important buildings, the Acropolis, behind a wall up on the top. It would have been beautiful. Of course, if you were up at the Acropolis looking down, that would have probably been even more striking. In the top right, you can see the altar of Zeus, one of the wonders of the ancient world. Zeus was hailed as the savior, very important place for the cult of Zeus worship. The bottom right, you can see that same theater that we looked at a few moments ago, but only at this angle you can see that it's right below the Acropolis. It's right below the main temples and government buildings of the city. And then further down below this theater would be the city with the common folks where they would have lived, where they would have had their homes. On the left, you can see a model attempting to reconstruct the original city. You see that same theater there, and to the right of it, you can see the great altar of Zeus. Right of that, you can see the upper agora, where the meat that had been sacrificed to idols would be offered on the market. Now, it makes sense that that agora would be right next to the altar of Zeus, because it's there at the altar of Zeus that a lot of this meat would have been dedicated to Zeus, and so you just take it right outside to the agora and make it available to those who want to purchase it. And then you can see several different temples, palaces in the background. At the far left, you can see the arsenal where they would have stored weapons in the event of a siege or that they wanted to besiege somebody else. Pergamum was a center of pagan religion in Asia Minor. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and victory, was the patroness of the city, and Dionysius, the god of wine and merrymaking, was the patron of the royal dynasty. So the family that ruled here before Rome took over, they thought that their family's god was the god of wine and merrymaking. So apparently a family that knew what it meant to have a good time. Now, a shrine to Asclepius, the serpent god of healing, uh, featured a complex of medicinal baths that lay at the base of the hill. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Now, this is a temple to Trajan, uh, emperor in the early 2nd century. So this isn't standing yet when the book of Revelation is written, but as we'll see when we get to Revelation 17, Revelation likely predicts the reign and rule of Trajan. He's one of those emperors who persecuted the church. And interestingly enough, he's the first emperor where we get to see the way they viewed the church from a pagan perspective. That is, there's some correspondence between him and a governor who is torturing and killing Christians, and that governor and Trajan have a conversation about what to do about Christians, how far to take it, etc. Very interesting that we have that from Trajan, and we'll examine that document at length when we get to chapter 17. Here's a picture of Pergamum taken at the overview. Obviously, it's a modern picture, and so you got the modern day Bergama in there, but you can see that you can still make out a lot of what was standing during the Roman period. At the top right, you have that Acropolis, where the altar of Zeus and all those other buildings where we've sort of focused on that area. Then you have the lower city below that. Way on the bottom left, you can see the place where you would have had medicinal baths for Asclepius, the serpent god of healing. And there's a number of theaters and temples spread about. Of course, you can see the stadium where the Romans would have had their chariot horse races. The one who has the sharp two-edged sword says this, I know where you dwell, where Satan's throne is, and you hold fast my name, and did not deny my faith, even in the days of Antipas, my faithful witness, who was killed among you, where Satan dwells. Now, you'll recall that I said whatever feature of Christ's appearance from chapter 1, whether it be the eyes of fire, the hair, his clothing, the sword coming out of his mouth, whatever feature of his appearance is mentioned when he delivers an address to a particular church, it's because that particular feature of his appearance has some symbolic meaning and some symbolic value that has bearing on this particular church. And so it is here. In a provincial capital where the proconsul, that is the governor, where the governor wields the right of the sword or the power to execute at will, the sovereign Christ, armed with a two-edged sword, issues a warning of his own. So a lot of Roman officials, most Roman officials, could not have somebody executed at will, but a proconsul could, and a proconsul was based here in Pergamum because this was the capital for this province. Uh, and so the Romans have tyrannized the world with their sword. They put people to death at will. And so Christ here is depicted as having a broadsword, a Thracian broadsword, if you'll recall from our lesson 2 weeks ago. And he is threatening the empire, reminding them that even though they tyrannize the world with the sword, there is a much greater sword of judgment that belongs to him. And the Romans would do well to cease from persecuting his church, or else they will suffer the wrath of the sword that comes out of Christ's mouth. Antipas is called my faithful witness. We talked about this previously, that the only other person in Revelation who is called the faithful witness is Christ, because Christ died for the sake of the gospel. Now, Antipas is called the faithful witness because he has died for the sake of the gospel. And this is intentional. It's to show us that the model faithful witness is the one who is willing to die and suffer with Christ for the benefit of the kingdom of God. Later tradition stated that Antipas had been roasted to death in a bronze bull during the reign of Domitian for standing against paganism, because the name Antipas means against all. And so some church authorities looked at this and said, well, it's because he was against all forms of paganism. That's why he was called Antipas. And they put him in a bull that was made of bronze, and they heated the bull and roasted him to death. Now, scholars don't place a lot of stock in this tradition because it comes late. Nevertheless, it may be true. We don't know. But whether he died this way or whether he was tortured and killed in some other way is not really the point. The point is that he kind of becomes the model for what we should be as people who are willing to suffer and die with Christ. Twice, Jesus tells us that Pergamum is the place where Satan dwells, and that's generated no small amount of debate among interpreters. Why is Pergamum the city where Satan dwells? The first possibility is that it's, again, the home of the altar of Zeus. Now, it's important to try to view this from an early Christian and early Jewish standpoint. Early Jews and early Christians did not believe that the gods were non-existent. When a pagan went and sacrificed an animal to a god, he didn't think that there was nobody on the other side to receive the sacrifice. Christians believed that the gods existed. They just didn't think they were actually gods. They thought they were demons. This is why Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 20 that the things that the pagans sacrificed, they sacrificed to demons. And so when a Christian would see a pagan go to participate in worship, he wouldn't go, oh, you're just an idiot because that God isn't really there and there's nobody on the other side to receive your worship. He would say, yeah, you're going to worship somebody that's real. He's not really a God, but he is a demon. And so you are demonically involved. Now, the reason why that matters here is because Zeus, from a pagan perspective, was considered to be the king of the gods. So Christians, from their point of view, Zeus would be considered the king of the demons, since the gods are actually demons who pander themselves and parade as though they were gods. Now, this may explain why it's the city where Satan dwells, because if Zeus is seen as the king of the demons, then that would make him equivalent with Satan. And so that's what some folks think. They think that's why the altar of Zeus indicates that this is the city where Satan dwells. You can see at the top right a picture of one of the illustrations on here. Throughout the temple, there was the story of how the gods had killed the giants in order to rescue human civilization. They believed that these ancient giants, these titans who had legs like serpents, were running wild on the world, creating problems, and the gods saved humanity by coming down and killing these giants so that human civilization can begin. Now, if you are a Christian or a Jew, you are going to interpret this as a demonic perversion of a certain story in the book of Genesis. In Genesis chapter 6, the sons of God, these heavenly angelic beings, come down and they have sex with women and create a race of giants known as the Nephilim. And the Nephilim were troublesome, they were problematic, they were warriors, and this was a dark period for humankind according to Genesis chapter 6. And so God sends the flood and kills the giants so that civilization can have another chance on this side of the flood. And so if you are a Christian or a Jew living in Pergamum and you see the altar of Zeus, you're going to see that as a demonic corruption of the story in Genesis 6. You know that it was the God of the Bible who rescued humankind from the giants of old. But the altar of Zeus, built to the king of the demons, is trying to give this credit to Zeus and his comrades instead of giving it to Yahweh. And so, as a Jew or Christian, you would have regarded the altar of Zeus with tremendous suspicion. You would have seen it as very demonic. And this may account for why this city is recognized as being the place where Satan lives. Another possibility is Asclepius, the serpent god of healing. Now, you can see Asclepius on the right. Sometimes he's with his wife, sometimes he's not, but he's always with a snake. At the top left, you can see a modern medical symbol where the serpent of Asclepius is retained. Now here at Pergamum, and you can see this depicted on the bottom left, the cult of Asclepius had a set of medicinal baths where if you were sick and you had some money, you could come and his priests would take care of you. They would give you these ritual baths, potions, and other treatments where supposedly the god Asclepius would aid in your recovery. Now, the reason why this is significant to us is because it's in Revelation chapter 12 and verse 9, where the devil is equated with a serpent. So when you get to Pergamum, and it's the place where Satan lives, and it's also kind of the headquarters of the serpent god of healing, this could account for why this city is recognized as being the home of the devil. But you'll find that most commentators will gravitate towards this option because Pergamum is the headquarters of Roman power in the region, and therefore this is, if a decision was made for the church to suffer, it came out of this city. A temple for the worship of Augustus was there. You can see Augustus at the top left. And Christian texts written after Revelation describe how persecuted Christians were rounded up and taken to Pergamum. Eusebius mentions some martyrs from the city, a guy named Carpus, another guy named Publius, and a woman at Pergamum whose name is Agathonisi. He says, quote, "They were perfected gloriously after many magnificent confessions." So if Christians were going to be put to death, remember this is the city that has the power of the sword. The proconsul is there, the governor, and Christians were gathered up, they were taken here. This is where they would have had trials. This is where they would have been put in jail. They would have been tortured or executed. And so this probably has a lot to do with why this city is recognized as the place where Satan dwells. Now, it's true that it doesn't have to be one or the other. I mean, you could live there and you could see the altar of Zeus, the king of the demons. You could see the serpent god of healing. You could see that this is the headquarters for the authorities and their persecutions of Christian people. All of these things combined probably account for why this city gets this negative attribution. At this point, we need to talk a little bit more about Emperor Domitian, because scholars have difficulty explaining why Emperor Domitian would have persecuted the church in Asia Minor at all. Asia Minor is a long way from Rome. Christians are politically insignificant. Why would Emperor Domitian do this? And the simple answer is we don't know. But some historians have attempted a historical reconstruction of how the church could have come to be persecuted at the time of Emperor Domitian. So I want to take an excursion here and sort of talk about this. And ultimately, the reason has to do with Domitian's tensions with the Senate. But to explain that, we need to begin by talking about his family. Now, after Emperor Nero killed himself, it left the empire in disarray. There were a number of claimants to the throne. There was civil war, and it wasn't clear that the empire would survive in any sort of a real way, or at least as a unity. Well, Emperor Vespasian changed that. At the time, he was a general, and he was fighting in Judea. He was trying to put down the Jewish revolt that eventually led to the destruction of the temple. And he went to Rome to become emperor, and unlike several other people who had tried to take advantage of the chaos, he actually succeeded, and he reigned for 10 years. Now, Vespasian is not the sort of guy you would expect to be emperor because he did not come from an aristocratic family. Usually you had to have the right kind of pedigree. You had to have the right family line. My father was a senator, and his father was a senator, etc. Well, Vespasian was not like that, and he was not familiar with Roman politics. He had spent his life in the military. He was sort of a ruffian. And for that reason, a lot of senators didn't want to accept him. Now, they had to, because he had the power of the military, and also because he had control of Israel, he also had control of the empire's food. The land of Israel in and of itself wasn't worth much to the Romans in comparison with other provinces. What made the land of Israel so valuable is it was a gateway to Egypt. The grain fields of Egypt, that was the breadbasket for the Roman Empire. And so Israel was very valuable, not because there was anything in Israel necessarily, but because Israel was the gateway to all the food supply in Egypt. And so since Vespasian, who you can see here on the top right, since he had control of Israel and he had control of Egypt, he had, the proverbial deal that could not be refused. He had all the food, plus he had military power. And so he comes in and takes the throne. And the Senate criticized him routinely. They had to live with him, but since he didn't have a pedigree, he didn't have a family line with connections to politics in Rome, he was always criticized, but he came to be admired because he took it in stride. He didn't take himself too seriously. He usually responded to the Senate with humor, and for that reason, he was a good emperor until his death in the year 79. Now, Titus, his son, did not reign that long, from 89 to 81, and he was loved because of his military victories. There's a lot of tough guy stories about Titus. There's one where the horse under him gets killed in battle, and he looks over and he sees another horse whose rider has been killed. And so he jumps on that horse and does whatever it takes to continue to lead his men into battle. And he also condescended to the level of the common people. The Romans would get in these public baths, these big swimming pools that were heated from underneath, and they would a lot of the politicians would not get into the baths with the common people, but the Emperor Titus was different. He would get into the baths with the common people, and thereby he endeared himself with the senators and with the commoners. Now, the reason why I say this is because even though Vespasian and Titus did not come from a political family, they were accepted because of their talents and because of their warm personalities. Now, Domitian is another story. Domitian here at the bottom right. Domitian could not get along with the Senate. He was quiet, introverted, and unfriendly. At the time, whenever the Senate and the emperor would get together to discuss politics and to discuss political solutions to problems, afterwards there would be a drinking party, and there were certain social expectations of the emperor. He would hang out, he would drink, he would become available for casual conversation, and he would be friendly. Well, not so with Domitian. Domitian was so quiet and introverted that he wouldn't stay and drink. He wouldn't stay and socialize. He had kind of a cold and dark personality. And he would withdraw from social situations and go to his palace. And on a level of personality, he just could not endear himself with people because he was not a sociable man. Domitian was 12 years younger than Titus, and unlike Titus, was not educated in the imperial court. And so Domitian got a lot of flack because he was not educated. Now, he tried to rectify this problem by taking up poetry and other intellectual engagements, but it didn't work. Nobody ever saw him as being educated enough to be an emperor. Domitian tried to get some accolades as a military conqueror, and he launched a number of wars and put down rebellions. But it was never interpreted quite the way he wanted it to. He went to Germany, and he couldn't really find anybody to fight. He fought with the Dacians, but since Domitian's own men caused that war, it reflected poorly on Domitian. He fought with other people, but he was seen as a tyrant who attacked folks in an unprovoked way. And so Domitian was never able to establish his legitimacy by traditional means. He didn't have an aristocratic family. He didn't have intellectual gifting, and he was not a military commander by any stretch. And so the Senate despised him, and it's very difficult for an emperor to rule the empire well without the support of the Senate. And so he had to secure his legitimacy in some way that has nothing to do with the Senate. And this is why he turns to the emperor cult. Now, Domitian is known to have required worship on an unprecedented scale. He required that people refer to him as Lord and as God, and he's well known in the sources for requiring worship in a way that was far beyond anything emperors before him had required. You can see a statue of him in the top right, or at least what remains, the head and the arm. This was extracted from Ephesus, from the temple of Domitian, and people were required to burn incense to this statue and to recognize the divinity of the emperor. In a previous lesson, we talked about how when Domitian's son died, his son was called the son of a god, because Domitian was a god. Well, Domitian went even further than that, and he said, well, since my son is a god, and I am a god, that makes me the father of a god. And so a lot of bellicose and blasphemous language comes out of Domitian as he tries to secure his hold on the empire through the emperor cult, because he had so many problems with the Senate that he couldn't use traditional means of legitimacy in order to uphold his rule. Now, all of this has consequences for Asia Minor. Asia Minor was always desperate to prove that they backed whatever emperor was on the throne, because they had kind of a bad reputation. In the 2nd century BC, or excuse me, in the 1st century BC, Mark Antony and Cleopatra fought against Octavian, Caesar Augustus, and Asia Minor had the reputation of having backed up the wrong guy. Mark Antony, you see him here on the top left. And so because Asia Minor did not support the most famous line of emperors that Rome produced, they always were trying to prove that they are in fact faithful to Rome and to the emperors. They just made a mistake when they backed Mark Antony. As you get toward the time of the book of Revelation, a number of things happened. First of all, Asia's proconsul, Asia's governor, had been executed in the year 87 or 88 for conspiring against the emperor. Now this made the authorities in Asia Minor, in our 7 cities that we're concerned with, they really wanted to prove to the emperor that they were faithful. And if he wanted the whole world to recognize that he was a god, well, they were going to make sure that happened. And also recently, Domitian had been putting down rebellions, and so everybody was kind of on edge and wanted to prove to the emperor that they were loyal. Now, it was on the heels of these events that Domitian's temple was launched in Ephesus in the year 90. Remember, Revelation is probably written in the year 95 or the year 96. So right when Asia Minor was trying to prove to the emperor that they are loyal, that they are faithful, this is when Domitian wants to launch his emperor cult right there in their region. And this has a lot of consequences for Christians, because at the time, Ephesus, they would take a statue of the emperor and they would roll it down the street. And every house was expected to put some sort of an offering out on the front porch, if they had porches, in front of their door, to show that they supported the emperor. Well, if you find that there are houses that don't have offerings to the emperor, and you go and investigate these houses and they all belong to Christians who say that they cannot recognize the divinity of the emperor, this is going to bring a lot of negative attention to the church. And the authorities in Asia Minor are not going to like this very much, because they're trying to impress the emperor with the fact that everybody recognizes he's divine, except for these Christians. And so this probably has a lot to do with the persecution of the church. Informants were empowered under Emperor Domitian. He was so paranoid that anybody could tattletale on anybody, and he would do something about it. Even slaves could tattletale on their masters. A slave goes to a Roman officer and he says, my master doesn't believe Domitian is divine and he thinks he's an idiot. Well, the authorities were obliged under Domitian to go and do something about that. Now this is very troublesome for Christians, because Christians had a lot of enemies. There are a lot of people who could come and snitch on them. Hey, I know a Christian who thinks that Caesar's not divine and he seems like he's kind of a troublemaker. That sort of informant can create a lot of trouble for a Christian at this time. Now, Domitian revived a Jewish tax. So, in the ancient Roman Empire, there were Jews all over the empire, and once a year they collected a tax and they sent it to Jerusalem in order to support the temple there in Jerusalem. Now, after the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, Emperor Vespasian said that they still need to send that tax, only now they're not going to send it to the temple, they're going to send it to Rome. And so this was the Jewish tax. Now, throughout Vespasian's rule and throughout the rule of Titus, this tax was not really enforced. It became a very lax thing. However, Domitian revived this tax, and the way he revived it probably got the church in a lot of trouble. We talked about this 2 weeks ago, that Suetonius, the ancient Roman historian, states that it wasn't only Jews who had to pay the tax, but anybody who looked like who lived like a Jew. So that means that Christians were probably required to pay this tax. Christians worshiped the Jewish God, studied the Jewish Bible, and had their origins in the land of Israel. And so even though Christians did not identify with the temple, even though they did not identify with the Jewish faith, they likely still had to pay the Jewish tax. And this is probably what got so many Christians taken into custody. If a Christian did not or could not pay the Jewish tax, he would be brought into custody, he'd be forced to pay if he could pay, and he would likely be required to affirm his allegiance to the emperor by burning incense to the emperor and acknowledging his divinity. Well, obviously a Christian could not do that. Whether he had the money to pay the tax or not, a faithful Christian cannot acknowledge that the emperor is a living God. And so this is probably what got Christians taken into custody. This is probably what led to the persecution that had John sent into exile, that had Antipas killed, and that is responsible for creating the book of Revelation. Now, we're not sure about all of this. We're just taking the pieces of evidence we got and making the best we can out of them. But it makes sense, and it's probably right, or at least it's probably very close to what happened. At the top right, you can see a coin of the Emperor Vespasian celebrating his defeat of the land of Judea and putting down the Jewish revolt that led to the destruction of the temple. Rome is personified here as a man who's standing over a woman who's been shamed and humiliated. And so in the Roman logic, that means she's been enslaved and she's been sexually debased. She's been raped. To the modern mind, that might seem a bit outrageous that you would put something like that on a coin. But this is the way that Romans celebrated their victory. We are like a big, strong man, and our victim is like, a small girl, and we've had our way with her. This is the way the Romans celebrated the defeat of the Jewish people. And again, we've seen this guy a number of times. Bottom right is Suetonius, the historian who's responsible for giving us so much of this valuable information. But I have a few things against you, because you have there some who hold the teachings of Balaam, who kept teaching Balak to put a stumbling block before the sons of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols, and to commit acts of immorality. Acts of immorality would, of course, be sexual immorality. Whatever the teaching of Balaam is at this church, we don't really know what it is. It permitted Christians to participate in pagan dinners and sexual perversity, as in the Old Testament story. Now, you'll probably recall the story of Balaam and Balak from the book of Numbers, chapters 22 through 24. Balak is concerned about the children of Israel who are moving through his land, and he wants the prophet Balaam to come and curse the children of Israel. And so they sacrifice a bunch of animals, and then every time Balaam is going to go curse the children of Israel, he receives a message from God that instead of cursing them, he should bless the children of Israel. And this makes Balak very disappointed, because Balaam won't curse them. And so Balaam says, well, I tell you what you do. I can't curse the children of Israel for you, but I can tell you how to lead them astray, and God won't protect them anymore. Send in women who can seduce them sexually, and bring them into your pagan dinners, bring them into your pagan orgies, and you can use sex to lead these guys astray, and then the Lord will forsake and abandon them, and he will not protect them. And you probably recognize the images on the screen here. In the right, you have uh, Phinehas. A Israelite man takes a Midianite woman into the tent, and Phinehas comes in, and with a single stroke of the spear, he kills them both while they are in the middle of their sexual engagement. So the one on the right is very plain, and the one on the left is the same scene. It's just got a whole lot more personality. Therefore repent, or else I am coming to you quickly, and I will make war against them with the sword of my mouth. Now it's interesting that this church, Christ doesn't hold the entire congregation responsible for the problems there. He seems to, at least with this church, to see a difference. There are those people who are like Antipas, who are faithful even when they are endangered, and then there's another segment that is compromising, that is participating in the pagan dinners, in pagan life, and all these things, and they think that's okay. They have some sort of a justification that says that they can do these things. And so Christ is going to make a distinction. He's not going to come and use the sword of his mouth to fight the entire church. He's going to come to the church, and he's only going to fight the troublemakers, because he recognizes that in this church there are those who are faithful and those who are unfaithful. And so he doesn't threaten to end the whole church like he does at Ephesus. He only threatens to fight against those who are compromising. Now, the scene on the left refers to the story of Balaam and Balak. And of course, this is a very famous story where Balaam is riding on his donkey, and his donkey will not obey because the donkey can see the angel of the Lord holding a sword. And then when the angel of the Lord reveals himself, he says, "This donkey just saved your life. Had you continued further, I would have killed you and let the donkey live." Now, this is probably why Christ threatens these people with the sword coming out of his mouth. They have the teachings of Balaam. And so just as Balaam was threatened with the sword of the angel, and the sword of the angel of the Lord in Numbers chapter 22, so the people at this church who have the teachings of Balaam are also going to be threatened with the sword. So again, it's not random that this church gets the language of the sword that comes out of his mouth. It's because they have the teachings of Balaam, and the story of Balaam notoriously had this element where Balaam was threatened by a sword. To him who conquers, to him I will give some of the hidden manna. And you all know this story very well. As the children of Israel traveled through the wilderness, God miraculously supplied manna for them 6 days of the week, every day except for the Sabbath, for Saturday, because you could not go out and gather food on the Sabbath. So why is Jesus offering them manna? Well, this may have to do with the common Jewish belief that was based on passages in Isaiah, the common Jewish belief that in the Messianic period, manna would come down from heaven yet again. In 2nd Baruch, an apocalypse written in the 1st century, it says, "And it will happen at that time that the treasury of manna will come down again from on high, and they will eat of it in those years, because these are they who have arrived at the consummation of time." So Jesus may be tapping into this common expectation that one day the manna is going to come back. But he says the manna is hidden. Why is the manna hidden? It could be that the church here is fighting the people who have the teachings of Balaam are Gnostics. Now, Gnostics claim to have secret knowledge that came down from the apostles that is not available to the rest of the church. So you might have the church in Ephesus and Pergamum and Smyrna. You might have a line of bishops that go all the way back to the apostles, but they don't know the truth. Christ and the apostles gave secret knowledge only to certain people, and you can only access this knowledge if you're in their little clique, in their little circle. And so there may be Gnostics there who claim they have secret knowledge from Christ or secret knowledge from Peter or from whoever. Uh, and so Christ may be saying here, do not be taken in by their promise of secret knowledge. Instead, be faithful to me, be faithful to the teachings of the church, and you will receive the secret or the hidden manna. That's just one idea. Another idea is that it might refer to the manna in the ark. There's a tradition that's recorded in Hebrews chapter 9 that there were three things in the ark, the Ten Commandments, Aaron's rod that budded, and a jar which held the manna. We'll see the Ark of the Covenant show up later on in the book of Revelation. And so we know it's on the writer's mind. We know it's part of the imagery. And since there's manna in the ark, and it is hidden, obviously, because it's in the ark, Christ may be promising to feed them with the manna that is in the Ark of the Covenant, which is a very interesting idea. And I will give him a white stone and a new name written on the stone, which no one knows but he who receives it. This is the fulfillment of a promise from Isaiah chapter 62, where God says, you will be called by a new name that the mouth of the Lord will bestow. So this is where the naming aspect comes from. A lot of the promises that are given in the book of Revelation come from the book of Isaiah. Isaiah is full of a lot of very beautiful promises. The Isaiah passage, the context is the New Jerusalem, where God is marrying his bride, and there's the salvation of all the nations. That context in Isaiah will be drawn upon in the book of Revelation time and time again. But why a white stone? There are a number of ideas, and I'll just share three of them with you. One is that this could be a reference to a magical amulet. A lot of pagans carried stones or amulets around their necks that they believed would ward off evil and protect them from evil influences. Christ could be saying something to the effect of, don't put on one of their magical amulets, but instead I'll give you a white stone. There are folks who go that route. I don't think that's necessarily the most popular position. Another idea is that it could be a verdict stone. If you were on trial for a criminal offense in the ancient Roman world, the jury would deliberate as to whether or not you were innocent and guilty. And if they found you guilty, they would present the court with a black stone. A black stone says, we found the guy guilty. But if they found you innocent, they would present the court with a white stone. Now, if Christ is using this in reference to a verdict stone, he is saying that, be faithful to me, and the heavenly court will produce a white stone as a token of your innocence, that you have been vindicated by the heavenly court and by the heavenly judge. So that's one idea. Now, the idea I like the most is the idea of an invitation stone. So, in ancient pagan dinners, the host would go out and he would give a certain type of stone to the people he invited. And when you arrived for the pagan dinner and for everything that came with the pagan dinner, sexual immorality and eating food sacrificed to idols, you would produce your stone at the door, and it was sort of your ticket to get into the dinner. So Christ may be saying, I will give you an invitation stone so that you can get into the marriage supper of the Lamb. And this seems to make sense because he just talked about food. He says, I'm going to give you to eat of the hidden manna, the bread that comes down from heaven. So since he just referred to a heavenly dinner, the invitation stone makes sense. He's saying, refuse the invitation stones to go to these pagan dinners, and I will give you my own invitation stone, which is not only the fulfillment of the promise in Isaiah that God is going to give you a new name, but it is also your ticket to come and to participate in the marriage supper of the Lamb.